بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. All praise belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for granting you and I this existence and for granting us the opportunity to continue these weekly shows here on Enlight Media. We want to welcome you all to our Friday night program, Novel Perspectives. And inshallah, tonight we are honored to be joined by Dr. Ulrick Vieux, who is actually someone who is very active in discussing various topics regarding racial injustice and is actually a psychiatrist by profession. So we're very honored to have it. Inshallah, tonight, the topic that we have given is this topic of institutionalizing equity. And we want to continue these various discussions that we've had over the past few weeks regarding the diseases and ills that exist within our society of racism, bigotry, and various forms of discrimination. Actually, as you know, last week, in fact, last Friday, was Juneteenth, which was a day, as you know, refers to June 19th, a day commemorating June 19th, 1865, a day when they say that General Granger came to Galveston, Texas, to finally alert the enslaved folk in Galveston, Texas, that they were no longer enslaved. In fact, this general informed these slaves that Abraham Lincoln had actually signed the Emancipation Proclamation, not a few days before or a few weeks before. In fact, 2.5 years prior to him coming there, Abraham Lincoln had actually signed the Emancipation Proclamation. But June 19th, 1865, they say, is when these final slaves in the southern parts of these colonies finally heard news of their freedom. And hence, it's a great day of importance for this country and specifically for the freedom of African-American people. And actually, if you really think about this day of Juneteenth, I think it's a perfect, unfortunate microcosm of the delay in justice of true freedom being granted to the African Americans in this country. And the reason I want to mention that we've titled this program Institutionalizing Equity is because we've established in our previous programs and discussions that the issue at hand, which truly plagues our society, is that of institutionalized racism, not just individual biases and prejudice. We're talking about a society where our systems and institutions have been designed in ways to impede the progression of people of color, where structural impediments have been placed to prevent the upward mobility of people of color, and specifically that of African American people. So having identified institutional racism as a core problem, we now want to discuss, now that we've identified this, how can we replace institutional racism with institutional equity, a society in which all human beings, irrespective of their superficial physical differences, can function and progress as much as their talents, abilities, and inclinations will allow them. The ability to have access to the same resources, the right to exist, not be hounded by racial intolerance, not be hounded by racial profiling, and not to be assaulted because of nothing other than the color of your skin. So this is the discussion we want to have. How can we try and create a society in which all human beings are able to claim their God-given honor? Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ وَحَمَلْنَاهُمْ فِي الْبَرِّ وَالْبَحْرِ وَرَزَقْنَاهُمْ مِنَ الطَّيِّبَاتِ وَفَضَّلْنَاهُمْ عَلَى كَثِيرٍ مِّمَّنْ خَلَقْنَا تَفْضِيلًا. That surely we have honored the children of Adam, meaning human beings. Allah is saying, I've honored all of you. And we want to be able to create a society and live in a world where all of us are able to claim that God-given honor, and we are able to live with justice and equity as Allah has commanded us to do. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu kunu qawwamina lillahi shuhada'a bil qist wa la yajrimannakum shana'ana qawmin ala alla ta'dilu i'dilu huwa aqrabu lit-taqwa wattaqullah innallaha khabirun bima ta'malun. That Allah says, "Oh, you who believe, be upright for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, bearers of witness with justice, and let not your hatred of a people incite you to not act equitably, and act with justice. I'dilu, for this is nearer to piety, and be careful of your duty to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for surely He is aware of what you do. And truly it is only by embracing and engaging in these sometimes tough and uncomfortable conversations that we can hope to try and bring about some positive change." So inshallah, with that, I'll ask Brother Hassanain to make some introductory comments, and then inshallah we'll engage in the discussion with Dr. Vieux.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's an honor to have you, my brother, Dr. Ulrick Vieux. We've known each other for many decades, alhamdulillah, and it's truly a blessing to have you on our panel because, especially with our experiences together and what we've gone through, I think it's such an appropriate time for us to discuss these matters, not only for the sake of discussion, but to educate the public and to instill in them a direction. Because I think the problems that we're being faced with, especially with institutional racism, is a problem that we all recognize, but many of us don't know how to deal with it. It's a monster. It's the elephant in our room, and we don't know how to get rid of it. And I think talking about it and understanding the dynamics of it will, inshallah, enable us to approach it more effectively. And I'm hoping then within in other words, the next 10 years, that we eradicate this institutional sickness called racism that's prevalent in our societies. And having a discussion with you even today, there's so much that we want to share with the public, things that the public needs to know on why the problems we have and what we have. So let me do a brief introduction. As an introduction, first and foremost, the principle in Islam, the Qur'anic principle, is that we must practice justice. Quran is emphatic about the fact, as Brother Aamel mentioned beautifully, that we need to practice justice, even if it comes against us, right? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves people who are peacemakers, who are people who promote justice. So Allah, for example, in Surah An-Nahl, in verse number 90, Allah says, Inna Allah ya'muru bil-adli wal-ihsan wa ita'i dhil qurba wa yanha 'anil fahsha'i wal-munkar wal-baghi. Right? Ya'idukum la'allakum tadhakkarun. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala beautifully says He commands justice, good conduct, and giving to relatives, and forbids immorality and bad conduct and oppression. And He admonishes you so that maybe we will be reminded. And that's very critical to understand, that maybe we will be reminded, because reminding is very beneficial. فَذَكِّرْ إِنَّ نَفَعَتِ الذِّكْرَ. So that's the objective, is how do we as a society instill the natural order of justice that God is pleased with, and not with our foolishness where we want to try to marginalize a group of people, to try to take benefits and deny others the benefits. That's one. Number two, I want to also define the word institutional, because when we say institutionalize racism, we're talking about institutionalizing equity. So we want to bring an institutional equity. Why is the word institutional being repeated, right? If it's negative, does it have a positive quality? So let's define it. It's an interesting definition in the dictionary. Institution has many meanings. But one of the meanings from a sociological point of view, and I'd like to pay attention to that, is a well-established and structured pattern of behavior or of relationships that is accepted as a fundamental part of a culture, or as a marriage. In other words, it's accepted. It's an integral part of our life. So enslaving people, looking down on people, making incendiary negative jokes about other cultures, you see, when it becomes institutional, it's almost like even if you don't want to do it, you have to do it, right? Which is very sick. And I think I would like for you, first of all, to introduce Dr. Ulrick, these terminologies, and then of course we want to talk about specifically about sympathy versus empathy, because we had a good conversation on that. And I would like to understand from your perspective, because you're a mental health expert, you're also a physician, you studied medicine, and then of course you're also in psychiatry. And what's beautiful about your experience is the fact that you're a Muslim, a God-fearing individual. You're educated, you're an academician, your father is very educated. So you come from a very strong academic background. So I think your input is very important in this conversation. So if you can just introduce that subject, please, and then inshallah we'll continue with this.
Assalamu alaikum, brother Hassanain. And I also want to start it off by saying that one of the reasons why I'm in this position is because of you. And I'll tell you why. Before I went into psychiatry, I was a family medicine physician. And I liked family medicine because it gave me the opportunity to see the body from the biopsychosocial perspective, from the entire holistic perspective. And I remember attending one of your lectures, and you said, you asked us, what is the definition of a miracle? And some people say, well, a miracle is so-and-so, so-and-so. But then your answer was that the definition of a miracle is changed behavior. That led me to really think about psychiatry. In medicine, I was dealing with patients that had hypertension, diabetes, all of these almost man-made disorders. And how do you change that? And in many ways, these disorders, especially when you're looking at impoverished communities, it can be a secondary to the environment, not having access to fresh food, not being access, only having access to fast food issues, not having the proper wealth. So one of the things that we have to kind of talk about the institutional perspective is how the entire system can be problematic, and how do we break the chains that are enslaving us.
Excellent. So I think there's something with your audio. We're hearing. Are you hearing that, Brother Aamel? The audio a little bit, yeah. Is there something? There's a wire or something that's touching. It seems to be making a lot of secondary noise when you're talking.
Not that I know of.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of feedback. But
wait, let me see if I turn off the fan. Maybe that might help.
Yes. The fan definitely, yes.
So let me go see if that helps.
Yes, no problem.
How's that?
Yeah. Well, I think when you come near it and talk, then we can hear that. Let's hear that.
Is that better?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Alhamdulillah. Yes. You make a very interesting point. You talk about man-made. You use the word diabetes, depression, right? I think you've used some of these words.
Hypertension.
Yeah. So let's describe that, because it's interesting that when there is oppression in society, even self-inflicted oppression, when people become unreasonable with their own goals, for example, or they don't give themselves the credit that they deserve, it may lead to all kinds of other issues, socially, psychologically, and so on, right? Can you describe from your experience, when you say man-made, we do know that there are congenital issues that happen to us due to some biological factors. But you're proposing the idea that while that does exist, a lot of that is exacerbated due to the ill behavior socially of people with reference to just common issues that should be handled differently.
Yes. So basically, the best way that I could think of answering this question is that human beings, we all have defense mechanisms, okay? Meaning, how do we defend ourselves regarding situations that we don't feel comfortable? So there are healthy defense mechanisms, and there are unhealthy defense mechanisms. So a healthy defense mechanism would be sublimation. Sublimation is that if there's something that I don't like, instead of doing that, I will do something positive. So let's say there's a person that I don't feel comfortable with. Well, I'll give that person charity, changing that behavior. Some people say that comedy, laughter is a healthy defense mechanism. But some of the negative defense mechanisms and how humans interact is the issue of projection. So meaning that there's something that I do not like about me, but instead of accepting that thing, I'm going to project that onto you, okay? And the issue is that sometimes a person, this is all subconscious things. So if a person is giving you this negative feedback, you may actually interact and actually absorb that negative feedback. But by the same token, it can also be we can find ways in which we can actually give each other positive feedback. So an example of negative projection would be, let's say that you're a school teacher and you see one of your students may be impoverished, or you may not necessarily like that student, and you say these negative things. The way you look at that student is a very negative way, and then that student will actually fulfill that negative prophecy. But by the same token, I cannot tell you how many times I've seen doctors, lawyers, really successful people that came from very challenging backgrounds, and they'll say that what gave me the goal, what gave me the desire to accomplish something in my life was that school teacher that believed in me, that one person. So I think that is so important. In fact, our example today, like when I first started to study Islam, Shia Islam, my interactions with you gave me so much support, and it really helped galvanize the way I see the world. So in many ways, so when we talk, sometimes when we talk about institutional, it can be very intimidating because yes, it's a very, very big process, but this one-on-one interaction is so vital.
And by the way, we are the foundation of the institution, right?
Yes.
Each one of us makes up the fabric of the institution,
Exactly.
right? And as you mentioned, look, you can have 100 people negative against you,
Mhm.
and then you have one inspiring teacher who really sort of supports you, and that could be your ticket to success, right? So it takes one right answer to cancel out the remaining four wrong answers in a test, right?
Exactly.
Use that metaphor. Yeah. So that, no, I'm honored that, look, we've been together. We went to Hajj together too, you know,
Yes.
and you know, what a beautiful, they say when you go to Hajj, you're brothers for life, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So it's an honor. And we've had a long history together. But you know what I love about what you have gone through is, and I've seen it, is that you've never seen the cup as half empty. I've
No.
always seen you live a life where the cup is always half full. Even though the world has sort of cut your legs off sometimes to try to stop you, to give you comments that are negative sometimes,
Yeah.
you know, which we all become victims of sometimes, especially you coming from a Haitian background,
Yeah.
and so on, right? But it's so beautiful to see that camaraderie, that brotherhood, even when you accepted Islam, you know, from Christianity, you know, and your father actually had requested that we meet, right?
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
it's an amazing history that decades ago we did this. And today we are in this new frontier dealing with the cancer that has come out. And I think that's important. And Brother Aamel, you can jump in at any time if you want to make pause any questions. But we were talking actually recently together, Dr. Ulrick, and you mentioned very elegantly that we have been living with a cancer of this racism, for example, for a long period of time.
Yes.
And the George Floyds of today are simply a symptom that's showing up that we have accepted for centuries as part and parcel of our lives,
Mm-hmm.
right? And today we have a president who is very blunt and upfront with his openness with regards to racism, openness with regards to white supremacy, and so on, right? And you made a beautiful comment, if you want to share it, with us. We had Obama as a president prior to this. And these are symptoms that are coming out as a result of reactions that were already prevalent within our societies, but we had figured out a way to camouflage it and sort of put a Band-Aid on this disease.
Exactly.
Yeah, explain that a little bit further.
And also what further state, like, what is the ideology of these feelings? The ideology is fear. Fear. I think there's a certain percentage of the population, and both Democrats and Republicans will agree to that the Obama presidency elicited a certain amount of fear. And then when you had the news that by 2050, this country may be a majority minority country, that really terrified a lot of individuals. And the problem with fear is that fear can be very irrational, and you can behave in ways that are not to your best advantage. So for example, individually, look at our brain. Our brain is basically divided into three parts. There's the primitive brain, which I'm talking about, the medulla oblongata. This is what helps you breathe, which helps your heart rate, things that we're not necessarily conscious of. Then there's the emotional brain, which is the amygdala, the limbic system. This is a fight or flight. And technically, most mammals have this, right? But what really distinguishes the human species is here, our prefrontal cortex. This is the part of the brain that's very developed. And this is where we have issues of empathy, intuition, okay? But if your amygdala is overshooting, right? So you're always on the, the fight or flight response, that's actually going to subdue your prefrontal cortex. So the frontal part of your brain that makes you human is not really functioning. So this fear that leads to racism is also hurting the person that's practicing. So in many ways, the entire society becomes problematic and is suffering.
You know, Dr. Ulrick, I just want to go in on one thing you mentioned about this concept of fear.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, one of the main causes, at least from my assessment of fear, is ignorance. You know, people, Imam Ali alayhi salam has a beautiful hadith where he says, "An-nasu a'da'u ma jahilu," that people are enemies of what they do not know.
Yes.
And oftentimes fear, one of the biggest causes of fear is ignorance, right? You know, that's why fear mongering is so effective. You know, when they portray, for example, Islam as a religion of terror, or they portray, you know, African-American people with crime and all of these broad strokes, and people have not, you know, interacted with Muslims perhaps, or they have not interacted with people of different colors. So they believe whatever they're told because of lack of better education, right? Because of lack of knowing better. And this causes fear, and hence why fear is so effective and, you know, riling up the masses. And I also want to go back to one point you mentioned. I want you to perhaps, you know, clarify and expound upon this, where you mentioned this concept of how oftentimes we as human beings have these unconscious biases that lead us to operate the way we do. And you mentioned, you know, the example of a teacher in a classroom, that if she has a preconceived notion of a student in her class, then that preconceived notion, that child, no matter what, is going to, you know, fulfill her prophecy. You know, it reminds me, you know, previously we had Mahmoud Abdul Rauf on our panel. We asked him, you know, when you when you refused to stand for the anthem, how many people actually came to you and asked you to, you know, explain your stance and explain why you were doing these things? And he says, no, not many. They just automatically condemn me from the beginning. And when we do that automatic condemnation from the beginning, then no matter what, that person is going to fulfill the prophecy we had already preconceived in our head. You know, and it reminds me of a quote by Malcolm X, where he said, you know, Malcolm X said, "What do you call a black man with a PhD?" And he said, "The N-word." Because he says, if you're convinced of people's, you know, fundamental inhumanity, if you're convinced that their culture should not respect them, no matter what they do, then whatever they achieve will be seen as an asterisk or an exception. So one thing I want you to, if you can expound upon, is how do we, as individuals at the grassroots level, overcome some of these unconscious biases that we may have, and use education as a tool, you know, to overcome these unconscious biases and preconceived notions, so that we don't fall into this, you know, state of, you know, projecting onto others what we have in our minds.
And excellent question. And I would like to say that, so what you're stating from two perspectives. You're stating from the person that's receiving this negative effect, that, you know, the projections towards them in a negative manner. So for example, the African American who shouldn't do well in the engineering class per se, you know, getting that negative information. And then on the other side, we're talking about the person that's actually bringing forth that negative philosophy, that negative thought process. I'm going to say that both people are being adversely affected. It is not really in the best interest of any of them. Concrete example. I'm sure many of us have seen pictures in the 20s and the 30s of African-American males being lynched from a tree. One of the things that always got me is that we focus on that poor African-American person that's being lynched. And many times these were innocent men being lynched. What about the entire community that was surrounding that and just looking at that? How do you go home? How do you raise your children? How do you have continue to live your life when you can demonize somebody in such a horrific manner? And you see this, how when these things are not adequately addressed, I gave you the example of the diabetes, the hypertension. So if you look at the African-American community, specifically the African-American community, a major issue that we're having is the healthcare disparities. Higher rate of hypertension, higher rate of diabetes, higher rate of certain cancers. A lot of that stuff is due to the stress that we feel, that we face. Even when you become quote unquote successful, you're still facing that stress. In fact, in many ways, the higher you go up in the trajectory of the world, the issues of the microaggressors become even that much larger. But on the flip side, you're seeing when you have this negative attitude of another person where you feel that you're fundamentally superior from a person, that's an example of narcissism. So the narcissist is a person that does not have empathy. The narcissist is a person that's very grandiose. They're not really able to connect with another human. And you'll see that this narcissist is never satisfied. Never satisfied. They can have all the money in the world, but they're not satisfied. And they're always searching for something that is not achievable because their level of emotion is like a bottomless pit. It can never be solved. So these things, this interplay, going back to the unconscious, has negative effects if it's not fully addressed, because you cannot demonize, marginalize, undervalue a creation of God without first demonizing yourself.
That's an excellent point you make. In other words, what goes around comes around, to use it in a different way, but it all originates, as they say, the fruits don't fall far from the tree, right? Mm-hmm. So when an individual has a very negative attitude, it's because they hate themselves more than anyone, and now they're projecting, as you use the word projection, on others in order to give themselves this false sense of security.
Exactly.
So let's discuss a little further on this question. We use the word sympathy and we use the word empathy, and we've had dialogues on this show with reference to these two terminologies, right? And when somebody says, well, I feel sympathy for you, do you have any sympathy for me, right? And you mentioned an interesting point that between these two, we should focus on the latter, right? As a society, we should avoid sympathy. We should actually live within the parameters of empathy. Please explain a little better.
I'll tell you, that definition was taught to me from one of my professors when I was doing my residency, a very, very prominent physician. And the issue of sympathy is, think about it, I feel sad for you, I feel sorry for you. It's kind of minimizing that person. And when you feel sad for a person, in many ways, for many people, you may want to actually distance yourself from that person, Whereas empathy is, I feel for you, I feel your pain, and because I'm a human, because my prefrontal cortex is developed, I do not want you to have that pain because I feel it. So hence, I'm more likely to truly work with you and to truly have a healthier outlook, a healthier setting. So that's what is considered true brotherhood. And there's the other thing too. When you have sympathy, the person that's the recipient of the sympathy, you also kind of minimizing them.
Yes.
Kind of like that. So let's say you see a homeless person, and I feel bad for that person, so I'm going to give that person a sandwich, but let me do a little selfie before I give it to that person. And you're basically doing this show, and you only further making this person really feel bad.
Right.
Whereas the empathy is like, well, okay, I know you're having a tough time. I'll give you the sandwich to make you feel better, but let me talk to you. Like, what's going on? Is there mental illness? Do you need me to help make a connection for you to find a job so you can help yourself? That's how a society, a healthy society functions.
So maybe one way we can say is that sympathy is a quick fix, and empathy is the real fix.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
So in other words, I want to feel good. I want to stand in front of God and say, look, I do have compassion. You know, I did do some good, and I can tell the world, look, I'm a philanthropist. I mean, I do care for the needy. Look, you see, I gave that person a sandwich. You see how nice I am? Look, I gave you a little donation, didn't I? Right? That's exactly, and you're so right. Even when we talked about institutional racism, you know, when people say, oh, we feel sorry for the Black population, I said the Black population doesn't want you to feel sorry for them. That's not what they're asking. They've never asked anybody to feel sorry for them. In fact, I'll make another very interesting point. Howard Zinn, I'm sure you've read Howard Zinn's book, History of the United States and its People, right? He makes a very interesting point, and correct me if I'm wrong, where he says the Black slaves and the white slaves were brought to the United States, as you know, how the white supremacists basically managed to separate them and to constantly target the Black population. But Howard Zinn makes a very interesting point. He said that before the Africans were brought in to work as slaves in the southern part of the cotton fields and so on, because of the extreme heat, they were using the South Americans, you know, people from the South American region as the original slaves for a very short period of time. And they were getting to be too expensive because they were not able to sustain themselves in that extreme heat. So when they brought the Africans, they found them to be extremely strong and resilient. And they were able to handle the difficulty. So the slave owners found that that's a better kind of an investment, which is tragic because, you know, it's like Salman the Persian, when he was traveling, you know, to find the truth, and he left the monastery, he was taken as a slave. And the condition of him being enslaved was the fact that he was strong and handsome, and he was resilient. And they felt that he would be a perfect person to work for us because he's strong. You know, while there is strength in the African population, I know I come from Africa. I mean, you see the African, the native Africans, they're very, very strong people, right? So it sort of comes out back as a curse against them because you're strong, we're going to enslave you. But by the same token, you'll find that historically, for centuries, having been subjected to this kind of tyranny, they have sustained it. You know, they haven't broken apart. Sure, the effects are negative, as you mentioned, the mental health problems, the social problems, all kinds of things. But I say to people, you target a people for thousands of years, or at least 2 centuries in this part of the world, see what the effects would be on any culture, on any ethnic group. Right? But for them to even reach where they are, that we had a president prior to this Trump to have become a president, that's an indicator of resiliency in so many ways. Right? And more resiliency to come. So the question for us, of course, is we're discussing some of these ills of what we call institutional ills. And this conversation is about institutional equity.
Exactly.
And I think it's important for us that while we address this within the time that we have another, 40 minutes, that let's talk about while we'll expose this, because there's a lot more exposure to be done. You mentioned something very interesting to me when we were talking with reference to how Hitler sort of took some of these templates in the United States, for example. And it's really, when you go back, people say, you know, the founding fathers were very, very good people. I say, how could they be good when they codified that all men are created equal, when in fact what they meant was all white men are created equal, right? And it became so accepted as an institution. So maybe they inherited that racism from Europe when they came. But the problem we have is that how do we talk about it so that we don't fall trapped into these templates that we think are the templates that will bring us success, but rather the template that God has given us that will truly bring success. So first and foremost, we touched on the principles of empathy. Do unto others as you want done unto you, right? The famous statements of prophets. Jesus, peace be upon him, stated that they do unto others. Why do you see the log? I mean, why do you see the speck in your brother's eye when there's a log in yours?
Exactly.
Right? Jesus says that, meaning have that empathy. Put yourself in the shoe. I know Imam Ali alayhi salam is telling Imam Hassan that how many times I put myself in the shoe of the future person, meaning that the older person, the person who has been older than me. You see, in other words, the person who has lived longer than me. And I have realized the mistakes that I would make if I were in those shoes. So learn from the mistakes of the past so that you don't make the same mistake. These are all principles of quote unquote empathy, but please continue describing that.
Yeah, no, definitely. All of those things are principles of empathy. And I love the example that you gave And it kind of goes back to my fundamental perspective about how even the people that are oppressing other people, they're also victims themselves, and it's also a thought process. So a way, you talk about the founding fathers, they could do what they did by saying that blacks were 3/5 of a human, basically dehumanizing them. But by dehumanizing them, they wind up fundamentally dehumanizing themselves, where 100 years from later, people are like destroying their statues. So their reputation has been completely destroyed. And again, it's a systemic issue. I mean, one example that I want to give that really exemplifies this. When I was studying for my boards to become a board certified psychiatrist, the way it worked, I had to have an oral exam. So basically, two psychiatrists would see me interview a patient. I had 1 hour to do this. I mean, 30 minutes to interview the patient, and then the following 30 minutes to ask me questions. Now, the thing about this interview was completely blind, meaning that the people in back of me, they didn't know the diagnosis of the patient. So it's very, very intimidating. So whether I passed or not was based on how much information I can get from this person. I go to Texas, right? First time I'd ever been to Texas. Funny thing is I wound up marrying a sister from Texas, but that was before that. So I go to Texas, and I'm a little bit scared because it's the deep South. You could not believe this. I see the patient I'm supposed to interview, older white male with a swastika and a Nazi sign tattooed.
Oh.
He sees me, and this is what he says. Hitler was misunderstood, and Hurricane Katrina was a cleansing. I'm thinking to myself, wow, this is going to be a fun interview. so I'm thinking, oh, please let this guy sit and let me, so I can interview this guy for at least 30 minutes, because if this guy left, I would have 58 minutes with these two guys, and they would say, what's your diagnosis? I don't have a diagnosis. I don't know what to say. So, but this is the beauty of it. This man stayed in the room with me for the full 30 minutes. And alhamdulillah, this was probably the best interview that I've ever had in my life. I wish it was taped. At the end of 30 minutes, this man asked me, when can I see you again? It broke my heart, but I have to say, unfortunately, as I told you before, this was a test, and I thank you for taking the time for me to interview you, but I'm not your full-time doctor. And he was disappointed. So he had to leave. So that was the end of the interview. And so these guys are asking me questions. And the first 15 minutes were the basic stuff, like what's the diagnosis, what medication do you want to give, and blah, blah, blah. Within 15 minutes, the proverbial elephant was addressed. It asked, do you like this guy? Did you like this guy? And I said, you know what? I liked him. And the reason why I liked him is that we connected. We had a therapeutic alliance. After what he said, he could have left, but he didn't. And then I said, this is where the empathy comes into play. This is a man, his entire life was either in jail or in the military system. That was it. That was his life. So if you think of you're a very sick person with a lot of significant mental illness and you're in the prison system, who are you going to surround yourself with? You're going to surround yourself, if you're a white person, you're going to surround yourself with members of the KKK or neo-Nazis, okay? But fundamentally, deep down, the fact that he was able to connect with me showed that the hatred was not as deep down within his soul as would be expected. So how many people are like that? So this is why we have to be very careful of just even making these broad strokes, because there are great people of all hues. And the challenge that we have as human beings is being able to connect from soul to soul.
I think that's beautiful. Sister Hafsa had made a comment, and I've used it many times. She says, connect before you correct.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Connect with, because find out that person, their yes could be your no, And that's what you really need to connect. You need to realign the definitions.
Mm-hmm.
And you make a beautiful point. When a person is in prison, they're survivors. You have to join certain gangs to survive in prison, right? And
It's
you
very
have to
primitive.
resonate a certain narrative. Exactly. And that's so powerful. And now when you look at this person and they're spewing out poison from their mouth, it's not necessarily what they actually mean. It's just that they're telling you that I'm tough. It's like people who live in the inner cities, right? You find if they don't use the foul language, they're weak. They're considered weak. I mean, you deal with gangsters, right? You've
Yeah,
dealt with youth from gangsters as an adolescent
yeah, of
psychiatrist.
course.
You've dealt with that a lot,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And it also goes back to what I've said. I mean, another example that I can share is that in our society, there's our personality disorders, narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder. Thank God this is only maybe 2 to 4% of the entire population, but that 2 to 4%, these people can cause so much fitna. They can cause so much havoc. I remember another professor that told me that what's the difference between a narcissist, antisocial in the inner city of the South Bronx or Harlem, compared to another person, right? And he basically what he said, the inner city narcissist, antisocial in the South Bronx will wind up being the head of the Bloods or the Crips, while the narcissist, antisocial person will wind up being the head of a Wall Street firm.
Or the president.
so it's amazing how the pathology manifests itself, and by the same token, these specific personalities can actually lead astray so many other individuals.
The Fir'auns, the Yazid, the Muawiyahs, the Fir'auns, right?
Exactly.
And they're driven. They're so driven that they make sure they get to that position, right? I mean, we have a president today who's a classic example of somebody, when he wants something, he gets it.
Yeah. But, I mean, again, seeing it from the balanced perspective, all of these people that are running for president are all completely, really, really driven. And that's what, our society kind of admires. The soft-spoken person is not necessarily going to get to that level. They're not going to get all these corporations supporting. So again, what do the people want?
And by the way, being driven is a great thing.
Yeah.
If you look at the principles of drive, right? Being driven. Look, the Prophet was the most driven man that ever existed in the universe, right? Imam Ali alayhi salam, from the day he opened his eyes in the Kaaba to the day he was struck in the mosque, this man was driven for 63 straight years, right? But positive driven to do positive things, to establish positive lifestyles, to create positive vibes for humanity.
Exactly. And to follow up with that, what is the beauty of Imam Ali? What's the beauty of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him? Is a concept of empathy.
Yes.
Yesterday, I was giving a lecture to the residents about reactive attachment disorder. So this is a disorder of feral children. So feral children are kids that literally, you've heard of kids that are raised by animals, or kids that had profound neglect. Okay, and how the first 3 months, the first 6 months of a human being is very important. So if you don't establish these connections between a parent, it's very tough for that child to ever form relations. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in Islam, how important is it for us to treat orphans with love and respect?
Very important. It's so critical. And what's amazing is that orphans somehow manage to make up the deficiency of their parent missing in their lives, right? And you find a lot of great people were orphans.
Yes.
All our great prophets, by the way, Ulul Azam, were all orphans. Even Jesus was an orphan. Yes. The Holy Prophet was an orphan. Ibrahim alayhi salam was an orphan, right? And it's amazing. So, but you're right. As a society, Quran is very emphatic. Exactly. They do not usurp the rights of the orphan, because they are the most vulnerable in society, because they don't have protectors.
And it's a manifestation of that society. Because if you live in a society where you're abusing these orphans, you're putting kids in cages, what does that say about you? That is sick.
Yeah.
That is ill. And those kids will grow up to we'll have lead to negative sequelae that the entire culture, the entire environment has to pay for.
Why do you, from your professional experience, and Brother Aamel, you can jump in anytime too, by the way, why do you feel that this 4 to 5% that you mentioned in the population that are narcissistic, who end up becoming usually the leaders of society, usually, not always, who end up creating a lot of trouble in society? I think Hitler was a good example.
Yeah.
You know, it's, the irony of Hitler was he wasn't tall, he wasn't blonde haired, he wasn't blue. I mean, that's the irony of a person, right?
Yeah.
Promoting the Aryan ideology, right?
Yeah.
But why do you think they become the way they become? Is there something that you have seen from your experience, from your studies, from your professional experience that causes this? And what can we as a society do to mitigate that? I think one you mentioned was show love and empathy to a child, especially in their infancy, so that they love and they make connections. That's one. But what's another observation you've made?
Well, I would say, I mean, let's be challenged. Let's challenge ourselves. I think the fundamental thing about people, the narcissists, like a person like Hitler, King Leopold of Belgium, these people were very the way they carried themselves, there was a certain persona that they carried, and they were very able to study a certain population and see how they can take advantage of that population to kind of manipulate that.
Machiavellian charlatans.
Exactly. So it goes back to the culture. So if you're living in a culture where you're taking care of the most vulnerable, people like that are going to be minimized. And you never know, maybe people like that, they may wind up developing the defense mechanism of sublimation. So maybe, it can be argued that some of these really evil people, if they saw that the way to manipulate society is not necessarily to do bad things, but to do good things, who knows how life could have changed.
Actually, I'm sorry to jump in, but actually the Quran mentions that, when God says to Moses, go to the Pharaoh, Pharaoh is a good example of an epitome of narcissism, right?
Yes.
And Quran says, فَقُولَ لَهُ قَوْلًا لَيِّنًا لَعَلَّهُمْ لَتَذَكَّرُونَ. Maybe he will be inspired if you talk to him with a soft tongue.
Yeah.
So God says, talk to him with a soft tongue, and maybe he will be inspired. Meaning Quran is saying that even these abject losers who we call narcissists, pontificators, self-centered, egotistic, self-aggrandizers, right? That if you approach them and they do some sublimation, as you say, maybe they will turn back and, they will turn and say, oh, you know what? I was wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Another thing I also want to point out too, these narcissists, they're not happy people. They are cursed. I mean, the narcissists, the antisocial, they have a very, very, very high rate of substance abuse problems. A lot of them commit suicide. I mean, these are literally tortured souls. But because they are so hurt, they're so wounded, they project all of this negative energy.
Wow.
I want to go back, Dr. Ulrick, to this, Hassanain, you mentioned the story of Prophet Pharaoh, and Allah tells him, قُولَ لَهُ قَوْلًا لَيِّنًا لَعَلَّهُ يَتَذَكَّرُ أَوْ يَخْشَى, that speak to the Pharaoh with a soft tongue, so that perhaps he may be reminded, so that perhaps he may have some fear instilled within him. And it reminded me of the story, Dr. Ulrick, you mentioned, of your interaction, with a man who had, not Nazi tattoos on him, but you were able to connect with him, right? Connect before correct, as we pointed out. And it reminds me of the story, a beautiful story of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, where they say that once Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam was in the market, and a man comes to him and starts, hurling the most vicious, profanity at him, cursing him, saying, oh, you people are like this, you are like this. But the Imam embodied this right away: connect before you correct. That rather than, reciprocating that profanity or saying, get this guy out of here, I'm from the Ahlul Bayt, who does this guy think he's talking to? He's in my city of Medina. He connects before he corrects. He says, he listens to the man talk. He says, look, you have an accent. I can tell you're not from this town. Why don't you come to my house and have lunch with me so we can discuss and talk? And it turns out this man, when they had a conversation, this man was actually from Damascus, Sham, where Muawiyah was ruling. And from there, from that region, all these people are fed was the propaganda of the hatred of Imam Ali alayhi salam. As you know, on the Friday pulpits, it was obligatory to curse Imam Ali alayhi salam and the Ahlul Bayt. So when someone has been hearing this propaganda all of their life, not necessarily by choice, thinking truly that, this is the way of God, this is the caliph is preaching, the pulpit is preaching this to me, this must be the right way. They come and they see Imam al-Hassan. So they're going to, think that what they believe in is true, and they're going to, project that which they have been taught. But Imam al-Hassan recognizes this. He says, no, let me connect before I correct. And they say that by the end of the meal, this man, swore that, I have been truly fooled by the likes of Muawiyah. And this Ahlul Bayt is, people of compassion, people of respect. And this is something I want to ask you about, Dr. Ulrick. We were going back to also the discussion of sympathy versus empathy. And you say, sympathy is just, saying, oh, I feel sorry for you. But, that not necessarily I want to do anything about it. Yeah. And versus empathy, where you truly want to, help the person, you truly feel their pain. But my question is how, from your experiences as a mental health expert, as a psychiatrist, how can we truly put ourselves in the shoes of other people? Because, some people might argue, I cannot truly be empathic to another person if I have not gone through what they have gone through. For example, if someone has a disease such as diabetes, some people might say, I can't truly be empathic unless I myself have gone through that same disease. And it is only when I have gone through that same pain then I can be truly empathic. And of course, we know it is true. For example, mothers who are against, drunk drivers, the ones that are usually the most against it are those who have lost their own kids, to drunk driving. So of course, going through personal experiences yourself does increase your level of empathy. But how can we as individuals who might not necessarily have gone through those same pains that other people have gone through, how can we, despite not having gone through those same pains, how can we still increase level of empathy within us to truly try and understand the pain of others and try and put ourselves in their shoes, despite not having experienced that same pain?
Excellent point. It goes back to the prefrontal cortex. Developing our prefrontal cortex, developing the aspect of empathy. So how do you develop your prefrontal cortex? Prayer, meditation. I think those are very, very important things. And in going back to your example, you don't have to be so concrete to the point where, I can only have empathy for you because, you suffer from diabetes, and you can still develop this empathy from the perspective that a person is suffering, and I want to alleviate your suffering, and just that human connection. That is how it can be developed. And also, sometimes you can connect to a person just based on your own life experience. One of the things that's helped me a lot is that I've often had the attitude that what may appear as a tragedy today in my life, tomorrow I may look at that thing as a blessing. And sometimes times when I've struggled, I've been able to tap those experiences onto talking to other people and actually showing empathy. So for example, the example that I gave of that patient that was a neo, KKK guy. I've never been a member of the KKK, but I can kind of understand this desire for this man that suffered from mental illness to connect with somebody, with this desire to find a support group. So even though his membership of his organization completely disgusts me, but I was able to empathize with the emotion that led to him joining that organization. And that was how we were able to connect.
One quick point to make, Brother Sain, before you jump in. When you said you were disgusted by his organization, but that does not prevent you from connecting. And that reminds me of the principle we have in Islam that we say, hate the sin, not the sinner. Brother Sain, but you can go ahead and expound on that.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And I think what you're saying, first of all, Brother Aamel is asking in simple ways, can somebody claim to have empathy without having gone through the exact set of problems? And I think you've answered it well. And I think it's important for the audience to understand that one needs not have the same exact experience to elicit the notion or the reality of empathy. In other words, I can be very empathic but within that framework of humanity, of pain, of suffering, of loss. You may have lost your mother and I may have lost my father. One cannot say, well, you cannot have empathy because you did not lose your mother, right? Any kind of loss puts you within that framework of empathy. And I don't think there's a human being on earth that can claim that they don't have the ability to exercise empathy because of one specific issue, because we've all gone through situations where we've lost loved ones. We've all gone through experiences of loss. We've gone through experiences of pain. We've gone through experiences of fear, right? Every one of us on earth has experienced that. So I think the empathic pathway is something that we should all sort of work towards to get that feeling, because I think the contrary idea of even sympathy implies there's a disconnect.
Exactly.
And I'm not like you. I'll throw a few bones at you. I'll throw a few sandwiches at you. I'll throw a few dollars at you, but then leave me alone. Well, that's not the cure to the disease, because the disease is in me now.
Exactly.
You see, that person who's poor, that person who's sick, that person who's suffering with the loss is actually my doctor. Because that person now has come to me and telling me that if you don't show the real empathy to me, then you are sick. And I'm going to help you get out of it by making you share what I'm going through. And as you mentioned beautifully, those pain moments, those loss moments become the stepping stool towards success of tomorrow. Because now we take those moments and say, wow, that was the highlight of my life. Yesterday, Sister Hafsa mentioned that in New Zealand, when her area was going through an earthquake and the whole building was collapsing, she was under a table. She was in the most precarious moment, right? But that was her defining moment in life. And she said, when I get out of this, I'm going to keep doing good work for the cause of God.
Exactly.
Right? People who go through near-death experiences, when they come back, the NDEs, they become much more spiritual and much more focused.
And I also want to add something, and going back to the essence of everything, the story of Imam Hussein and those 72 souls.
Right.
That is the perfect exercise of empathy. If you cannot find something in your soul,
right,
to feel that pain, there's an issue.
Big time.
And that is the fundamental, and this is why we're talking about the difference between empathy and sympathy. Why you gonna say, that's so sad. Oh man, that's awful. Oh, look at those poor babies dying. Oh, that's really sad. But if you have empathy, you're gonna defend. You're gonna want to end that horrific tragedy.
Yes.
And this is the essence of what we're talking about. The reality of the matter is, as I said before, 4% of the population just do not have that skill set. It's not going to happen. They're like robots. They were born that way. I mean, it's not even a family situation, because I've dealt the one clear case of an antisocial kid that I treated with. Parents were ideal. It was truly a curse. I mean, that's a bad way, but it wasn't really their fault. So the 95% of us that have this ability to have empathy, we need to work on it. And
I think that's the key point, Dr. Ulrick, is that if you've got 4 to 5% that cannot exercise empathy, and you've got 95% that can, why is it that the ones with no empathy are the ones actually affecting our institutional systems?
Well,
Quran addresses that.
Yeah.
God doesn't change the affairs of a community until they change it themselves first. And I think that's going to be a complaint on the day of judgment against us, that 95% of you had the ability to practice beautiful empathy, the kind that was real, and the one that was going to bring great change on earth. Why were you all so complacent about it?
Yeah.
And I think I addressed that to myself, right? We all have to be doers and changers of society in positive ways, where we can go in and affect people. And sometimes a smile could be enough to affect a person.
Yes,
and that's all it does, right? A person who may be contemplating killing themselves, but you give them hope and you say to them, no, that's not the direction I want you to go. And that person feels the empathy heart to heart. You mentioned frontal cortex. We talk about the brain, and I totally agree. These instruments are the gifts of God. But where the ultimate truth lies, it trickles down, unfortunately, but where the real exercise should be is the exercise of the heart,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Where we affect each other at the heart level.
Yeah.
When I say to you, Dr. Ulrick, I'm going to talk to you heart to heart.
Yeah.
It's very different to say from frontal cortex to frontal right? I'm going to rationalize with you my love for you, and my mind has concluded that I love you, right? Right? Well, you'll say, hold on. He'll say, I'm a psychiatrist. Here's my card. Come and see me, please. We need to talk. Right?
Yeah.
And one final point before we sort of wrap up this conversation. It's with reference to what we call white privilege, the word privilege. It's another word that is very, very powerful yet very dangerous, and I'd like to address that. The issue of privilege, right? So I have a couple of friends who are, they come from the Caucasus region, the Caucasus mountains. We call them Caucasians, right? It's funny how everybody's given a continent. There's no continent because they own the universe, right?
Yeah.
Everybody's African American, Arab American, Asian American, Spanish American, right? But then you got the whites, and they don't call themselves European Americans. But the question is, I was talking to this, and look, by the way, white, black, brown, yellow, all beautiful. And I have people of all, as we say, ethnicities who are just magnificent, right? We cannot say one against the other. But this person was very honest with me. He said to me, look, I get privilege. I'm light skinned and I get privilege. And I'm afraid with all these uprisings now after George Floyd, I'm afraid my privilege is going to be taken away. Bingo.
Excellent. Yeah.
That's something we need to talk about, because I looked at him, I said, what makes you think that when we're fighting for privilege for humanity, that it includes in that equation the deficit for you?
Exactly.
Whoever proposed that idea?
So basically, he's saying that he's limited. He's not free.
No, in other words, what he's saying is that if the black people get the same privilege he gets, he's going to get less of it.
Exactly. But he's still saying, but the bigger picture, what he's saying indirectly to you is that I am not a free person. I need to suppress, or I need to have this perception, which is still a perception. And this is, I'll give you another example to kind of follow that. As you know, I made Shahada when I was in medical school, okay? But medical school was a very, very spiritual moment for me. One of my classmates, a white male, first generation physician, okay? While I was going through this awakening, he was very much interested, okay? Very much interested. And I actually thought that he would also accept the faith as well. And I remember this one time, this guy just said to me, Ulrick, this religion of Islam, I see that you're really, really getting into this. It seems beautiful to me. It makes more sense than my philosophy. But Ulrick, I'm a first generation white man from Eastern Europe. My father is a blue collar person. I'm a physician. I can't give this up, because if I accept Islam, and we're very, very, very frank, this is a religion of brown people, of dark skinned people mostly, and the white people. I mean, you got Arabs, but they got names for Arabs as well. So it's like, it makes more sense for me to be a white Christian physician male, because there's a certain comfort. And I looked at this guy, I'm like, but this is not what your heart says. This is not what your heart says. And granted, I have not kept in touch with him since we graduated from medical school, but I really wonder how his life turned out, if he's really, truly a happy, comfortable person. I am free. I'm happy. I'm ecstatic. I love all the blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given me.
But think about it. Imagine you have that privilege, right? You have that special treatment because of your skin color, for example, just skin color.
Yeah.
That's one area that's huge. And then another is economic strata, right? Yeah. You're rich. People recognize you as a rich and powerful person. once again, you get those privileges, right? And many a times you'll find the rich people don't want poverty to be eradicated because then they will have to share the wealth, right? So their margins are higher when there's greater poverty. Look how sick this mentality is. This imbalance, the satanic imbalance, I call it, that causes destruction in society. But the notion of a person saying that I'm comfortable where I am, that's total lack of empathy. For an individual to say that I'm comfortable where I am, I know you don't get that comfort because you're not like me. And in fact, not only are you a black person, but you're a Muslim. Oh my God. And then you're a female too. Oh, stack it on because, there are 3 problems with you now, right? That means that the more you are on that side, the less privileged you will be. First to be black, second to be Muslim, third to be a female.
Yeah.
Look at that, right? And then for us to sit on one side and to say, you know what, I'm comfortable here. Well, I mean, that's a huge problem. I believe tacit silence, as Malik Shabazz mentioned, not being part of the solution makes you the problem.
Exactly.
But you were saying.
But it's all the narrative. Is all on how you view the process. So I mean, I tell you, a couple of weeks last week, I had a conversation with a very, very prominent psychiatrist, was a psychoanalyst, and she mentioned that in her career, she has never treated a black person that wished that they were white or of another race. There's something about being black where it's a beauty, it's a resiliency, it's a grit. I mean, I look at my background as a Haitian, and I look how literally my ancestors were the first and only successful slave revolt. I mean, that's like powerful. There's a freeness that I have. I mean, the fact that, again, I accepted Islam, but my ancestors are genetically like 60, 70% West African from places like Senegal, Mali. So what does that mean? That means that my ancestors that were taken from Africa were probably Muslim. And then 200 years later, I reintroduced my line to Islam, where to the point where I have a son named Musa. I mean, that's beautiful. That's
magnificent. And let me be candid with you, Dr. Ulrick. Honestly, I see some black people, in beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. Yeah. I mean, sometimes I feel envious that why is my skin not black?
Yeah,
that's how envious I feel sometimes. I said, oh, I wish my skin was that black. That's how beautiful I see it, right? But even this conversation, when we talk about one skin color to be more beautiful than another, to me, I don't see a single color that's not beautiful.
Yeah, exactly.
When I travel, I sit in the airport and I watch people, and I look at the whitest of the white and the blackest of the black, and I always ask myself, we have been told there's ugliness someplace in one of these colors, and I'm looking for it. Yeah. And and you look at people, you fall in love with their character, you fall in love with their aura.
Exactly.
And then added mercy of God is the skin color, the magnificent shape of eyes, right? You've got the Asian Oriental eyes, you've got the big round eyes. They're all magnificent. I haven't seen anybody with, Allah says, "Alladhi ahsana kulla shay'in khalaqa." And I believe that when you and I see ugliness in people, it means we have not connected with God correctly. Our faith is the faith, unfortunately, I must say this, teetering on what Iblis's faith was. Shaitan's faith, while he worshipped God, considered some of God's creations to be less than him in an arrogant, narcissistic way. The ultimate narcissist. The first lesson in the Quran, why God condemned Iblis, right? Yep, and says, if you're going to hold on to that policy, then you're not in my circle.
Exactly.
Right? So I think it's very important that we put that in perspective. And one thing that I'm happy is that this dialogue is taking place, not only from the political news level, but even among our scholars, among our communities, among our families. And I think it's very healthy. What we discuss, and we need to continue to discuss, is how can we discuss this with a level of direction and care to ensure that this issue is not hijacked and usurped as it was in the past.
Exactly. And I also want to add too, the issue that you made about the beautiful races, that is so true. But I think one of the issues that we do have is the economic perspective. So you have to understand that if you're a parent, you want the best for your child. So you also want to make sure that your child picks a partner that may be financially able to support them. So if there's a concern that a group is not exposed to all the financial opportunities, that's the other thing that we have to deal with. So this financial equity, this ability to really address the socioeconomic issues is also a vital way in addressing these racial issues. Because looking fine, tear down a statue, an idol of a soldier. I mean, you're not really doing much for people that really need help. So I think that's another thing that we have to look at. And this is the beauty of things like charity, things like zakat. This is why these are mandatory, it's mandatory things.
We should build institutions by which we can enable the disenfranchised, not only the Black population, but all populations within the spectrum of God's creation, right? Yeah. That they have equal access by which to be able to bring themselves to a certain level of dignity.
Exactly.
Nothing is more degrading than being in debt with, towards somebody else financially, right? Yeah. You borrow money from somebody. I don't care who you are. It could be white as white, black as black. You owe somebody money. It's very degrading.
Yeah.
Right. So financial, socioeconomic degradation as a result of that is also part and parcel of how we should work as a society. And that's why Quran says, "Man dhal ladhi yuqridu Allah qardan hasana." Who will give a goodly loan to God? Why is Allah saying that? Allah says, well, alleviate the burdens of your communities. Stop charging interest on each other because you're degrading the value of what the services you're giving, right? You're causing unnecessary harm on each other, right? Give each other goodly loans and help each other to reach higher economic strata so that you feel dignified. And inshallah, when those people reach a level of financial dignity, that they will contribute more.
Yes.
That's how we should look at it. Yeah. So yes, you're right. One of the conditions of bringing what we call institutionalized equity is to remove this bias that we have against a color, number one, right? Very clearly understanding that, and to see the magnificent beauty of God, and to contribute to establish institutions that enable people equal access to reaching economic status, right? And there's a beautiful story Sheikh Bahmanpur was giving where he was walking and he saw a black man who was a slave and with under abject poverty. And the Imam asks him, why are you here? He says, well, and he was eating bread. And as he's eating bread, he's taking one piece of bread and there was a dog in front of it. He would take this piece of bread, cut it in half and give the other half to the dog. And he would take the other half. So the Imam looks at him and says, who are you? He says, I'm a slave. He said, this is the only piece of bread I have. And the Imam says, well, you're feeding it to the dog too. And look how the man replies. He said, the dog is looking at me and I feel embarrassed to eat in front of the dog. You want to talk about morals. When you hear a person like that, you can tell me this is the poorest man on earth, okay, and he is a slave of slaves. You fall in love with this person.
It's
in
11 o'clock.
This person, in my opinion, is a more beautiful person than that very rich person with a cigar sitting on a high back chair who's got no empathy.
Exactly. So the reality, who's really the poor person?
Exactly. Great point. So the Imam was so touched by that, that he goes and frees him, finds his master, buys him and frees him, tells him you're free. But here's the critical point the Imam did, which all of us should take lesson from as we talk about socioeconomic equity. The Imam goes and buys him a piece of land and says, not only are you free, but here's a piece of land, go cultivate it, go build your life. Because when you're a slave, this, by the way, it's an excellent point to discuss on another discussion, is that the Emancipation Proclamation, what we call the freedom of slavery in this country, what it did basically was remove the visible shackles and put the invisible shackles. Today we have more slaves than we've ever had in the history of the United States. We have more slaves on earth today than ever in the history of the human race. Okay, we have more prisoners on earth today, in the United States than we have on all the 5 continents besides the United States, right? So there's another form of slavery. What happened is by the sweep of a pen, the slaves are emancipated, but they were not emancipated. Up to the 60s, Rosa Parks had to fight right here in Detroit to sit in front of the bus.
Yeah.
Up to the 60s. So there was no emancipation. But what does the Quran say? فَقُّ رَقَبَةٍ أَوْ إِطْعَامٌ فِي يَوْمٍ ذِي مَسْغَبَةٍ. What will make you understand what is these 2 pathways that God has given you, right?
Yes.
One is to free a slave. But the commandments in Islam is when you do free a slave, you protect them. You buy them, you guide them. And our imams were known to do the following. The Holy Prophet, he would buy the slaves. He would now, by legality, own them. And the slaves loved it. Because remember, when you're a slave all your life, you don't want to be put on the streets. That's the most dangerous situation you'd ever be in. You want to be put in the hands of a responsible leader who's going to now create a pathway for you to get back into the real world.
Yeah.
Right? It's like prisoners. If all your life you've been in prison, you don't know how to work. You do go to work, but you have no economic system, right? You are under a very rigid, formulated system. So in Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, when you free them, first, as soon as you buy them, their rights are equal to yours when it comes to equity, social equity. That means they have to live by your standards. And you have to pay them when they work for you. You bought them. They're your slave. Yeah, but you have to pay them now. And you have to give them love and equity, and you cannot hit them, and you must teach them.
Yes.
And the Imam used to teach them, used to educate them. Then on Eid, he would free them because now they were economically stable. They were socially stable. And they were understood in societies to be part and parcel of this fabric of the leaders of community who they respected. Like look at Bilal Habashi. He was under the wing of the Prophet and the Prophet protected him. Nobody could attack Bilal. Anybody who made an incendiary comment against Bilal Habashi, the Holy Prophet would jump in and stop. In fact, the Prophet took it another notch and made Bilal commander of his army.
Yeah.
And the Arabs of the time were incensed by that idea. That how can you make this ex-slave a commander in the army? That's a very high position. And the Prophet said, Bilal is qualified to be the commander in my army and you will respect him. So it's interesting when you find that our Prophet and Islam and the Quran and our preceding prophets have laid this foundation to what we call institutional equity.
Yes.
Unfortunately, we as a society have ignored it. We've ignored the Quran, we've ignored these callings, we've ignored these prescriptions often, and we've allowed these 5% narcissists to take positions and to make us slaves. And I think it's time for us, when Allah says, فَلْيَسْتَجِيبُوا لِي وَلْيُؤْمِنُوا بِي لَعَلَّهُمْ يَرْشُدُونَ. Therefore, respond to my call. You see? فَلْيَسْتَجِيبُوا لِي وَلْيُؤْمِنُوا بِي, and believe in me, right? So that you're rightly guided. So I think it's a good way for us to sort of focus. And as concluding points, inshallah, brother, Ulrick, you will make your final points. I think we have to be very solution-oriented.
Exactly.
And you are a physician, you're a psychiatrist, you're a philanthropist, you do work within your own circles. People ask me the question, brother, what can I do for the preparation of the return of the Imam? What can I do? What can I do to be part? The way Imam Hussein was saying, Hal bin Nasirin Yansuruna, and everybody shut their doors. And then Zainab said, shame on you. You have sympathy for my brother now, like you mentioned, when my brother wanted you to come and protect that interest, correct? What do we need to do? I believe if you have any kind of professional experience in any standard shape or form, give it to those around you. There are so many youth who need help. There are people suffering from mental health issues. Like for your example, right? For example, Dr. Vieux, right? You've got members in your community who are going through all kinds of issues. Let's not only cure those people, but train those who are not in mental health to be able to help those who have mental health, right? That whole collection of services that we give to our societies become the means by which we eradicate these evil institutions and replace them with better institutions.
Exactly. I concur 100%. I concur 100%. And I would also add too, is that we need to develop insight. Insight is understanding understanding what motivates us, because we all have blind spots. So we need to kind of understand what are our blind spots. And also the issue of empathy, the issue of caring for people, you need to kind of be able to go outside of your comfort zone, as long as you have the insight to not necessarily deviate, but actually reach out to other people. Maybe reach out to people that may not necessarily be of the same race, or even having a discussion with a person that may not be of the same faith, but actually discussing that will actually develop your faith even stronger, because sometimes people they're not very secure, and sometimes when we isolate ourselves, it's really a manifestation of profound insecurity.
I think the key word you said is get out of your comfort zone.
Yeah.
Imam Hussein alayhi salam got out of his comfort zone.
Yes, yes.
He had to face, his family being destroyed, but at the cost, that cost was worth paying for the sake of giving us all comfort zones.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a huge price to pay. But Brother Aamel, what comments do you have to say on that?
Yeah, I think, just as we were fast approaching the conclusion of tonight's program, I just wanted to make a few, concluding points. One regarding, we're talking about diversity of different colors and seeing beauty in everything. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala beautifully says, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ خَلْقُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافُ أَلْسِنَتِكُمْ وَأَلْوَانِكُمْ إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِلْعَالَمِينَ. That of his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth and the diversity of your tongues and your colors. And surely these are signs for those who are knowledgeable, alameen, right? This is point number one, that these differences of tongues and colors are signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And number two, I want to go back to the point we were mentioning about you and I cannot be tacitly silent when the face of oppression. It reminds me that, there was a story that a man came to one of our imams after the tragedy of Karbala and he said, my father did not actually kill anyone in Karbala. He wasn't there, throwing an arrow. He didn't actually kill anyone, but he was just, part of the army, and he was feeding water to the people in the army. What will his situation be on the day of judgment? And I don't want to quote direct words of the imams, but paraphrasing, the imam says, what? He will be like those who killed the imam, because he was there and he did not raise his voice and he did not stand to try and change the situation. So you and I cannot be tacitly silent, because you and I as Muslims have an obligation of amr bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar. This is an obligation. It's a command of God. Promote the good and forbid the evil, right? Promote the good, forbid the evil. That's what Allah says, kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat lin-nas ta'muruna bil ma'ruf wa tanhauna 'anil munkar wa tu'minuna billah. That the best in the community are those who promote the good, forbid the evil, and believe in God. And we don't need to hold high positions of power to bring about change. We don't need to. We can start at our own levels. I was recently listening, and I'll make this final point and we'll conclude. I was recently listening to Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, who's a professor of sociology at Georgetown University. And he made the very interesting point where he says, if you look at Martin Luther King was never elected to office. Yeah. He never had any official position in the government. He was not a councilman. He was not a congressman. He was a private citizen, but he was able to use his own God-given talents of oratorical prowess, and he was able to help awaken the masses. He used his talent to bring about change. And in fact, he worked because of his oratorical prowess, but despite the fact he did not even hold any position of government, he was able to actually affect legislation, right? They say that he worked with Lyndon Johnson on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 65. And in the aftermath of his murder, right, they passed the Fair Housing Act, all because of the awareness that he raised. And he was not even part of government. Just goes to show us that no matter where we are in society, just by raising our voices and doing what you and I can with our own God-given talents, can bring about change. And Allah will question us about that on the day of judgment. He will say, ثُمَّ لَتُسْأَلُنَّ يَوْمَئِذٍ عَنِ النَّعِيمِ. That on that day we'll ask you, what did you do with all the bounties and blessings you were given? Okay, you had privilege. Well, what did you do with that privilege? Did you want to keep that privilege to yourself and not share it with anyone? Or did you work to institutionalize equity for all of society, right? And this conversation of privilege and sharing privilege is uncomfortable for people who have privilege. And Dr. Dyson portrays a beautiful story and a beautiful a picture where he says, for those who have privilege, it's like you're in the sandlot of life and you have all the toys. And when somebody asks you to share your toys, it seems like injustice to you, because think it's not fair. Why should I share my toys? And you don't realize that, you have all of the toys when you weren't supposed to have all the toys to begin with. And the system was created in a way to unfairly give you the toys to begin with. And now that you have to share, it seems like oppression. This is what we talk about institutionalized racism, that it's so absurd even to share and create equality that it seems like, oh, this is injustice. Why should I have to give up my privilege? And, a final definition I want to share, we've been throwing out this term of privilege a lot. And Dr. Dyson gave a beautiful definition of white privilege, because, some white people might say that, oh, I don't have privilege. You know, I'm not wealthy. I'm not a millionaire. It's not like I'm saying I'm here, I'm working hard, I'm struggling. But Dr. Dyson gives a brilliant definition of white privilege, where he says white privilege is when you are given the opportunity to maximize your gifts, abilities, and talents premised upon nothing more than the pigment of your skin. This is white privilege. You have been given the opportunity to excel and maximize your abilities just because of the pigment of your skin. And the conversation we're having is how can we now take this away and give this ability to maximize your talents, abilities, and so on and so forth to all individuals, irrespective of the superficial physical differences that we may have. But inshallah, I think we're well over time, so we should start to wrap it up. I don't know, Hassanain, you want to make any final conclusions?
Yeah, just one final point. You mentioned Martin Luther King, you mentioned Malik Shabazz. You know, Malcolm X was very instrumental too in sort of carving out the direction that even the late Muhammad Ali recognized later on in his life, that his where the truth really lied when it came to what Malik Shabazz was saying. And Martin Luther King too was fantastic in what he did, for civil rights. Let's not undercut him either. But I have to admit that those of us who are not blacks, who are minorities from the Asian subcontinent, from the African subcontinent, or from the continent of Africa, where we come not as black people necessarily, but mixed sort of, that we get the benefits in this country, as minorities. But that blood that was spilled to get that legislation was predominantly at the hands of the black population. So let's recognize that fact. Okay. And I really think that those families that were enslaved in this country, I'm a strong believer in reparations. And I believe that one of the means by which our nations can move forward is to consider economic reparations for those children and families who suffered under this horrible institution of slavery. I think it's a very important topic that should be discussed later on. And let's not, I know there are people trying to sweep this idea that it's a historical effect, it's a historical event that should be buried under a carpet.
Yeah, but it still comes into play right now. We're still experiencing that. I mean, just the basic comment I made about the healthcare disparities. That's real.
And I believe even in Islam there's kafara, there's what we call a penalty, right? You go to Hajj and in your state of ihram you commit a sin during the state, there's a penalty. God is merciful. Why give me penalty? Well, because that's how you correct.
Yeah.
So for you and I to say, well, it happened in the past, it's okay, I forgot about it. No, there's a penalty to pay. And I believe that there has to be some, maybe that penalty could be the means by which to bring the socioeconomic status to where it belongs in social equity. That maybe there should be some penalty, not for us to hide under the guard that our forefathers were wrong. It has nothing to do with us. I don't agree with that. I think we've continued and perpetuated that many, many ways. And it's a different conversation anyway, but these are all means by which, inshallah, we hope and pray that we will bring social equity. And of course, we hope that when the Imam reappears, Imam Mahdi Ajallahu Ta'ala Faraja, that he will bring about this institutional equity as the final, issue without any question. Yesterday, somebody asked, what's the divine plan of God? Somebody asked the question yesterday during the question when we were having the dialogue with the sisters. And as a quick answer, the divine plan is as follows. It's in verse number 5 of Surah Al-Qasas. وَنُرِيدُ أَن نَمُنَّ عَلَى الَّذِينَ اسْتُضْعِفُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ وَنَجْعَلَهُمْ أَئِمَّةً وَنَجْعَلَهُمُ الْوَارِثِينَ. It is our desire to make you the oppressed, the inheritors, and the leaders of the society. You see, and I think that is the ultimate plan. So none of us should lose hope in what is happening today, because God's divine plan guarantees, just like even in the Bible, it says the meek shall inherit the earth. This is not something unusual. This is a divine principle. And let's take hope through that. And the best way to take hope through that is to act on it. And for you and I to be a participant in that. But Ulrick, if you want to make some final comments before we end.
I thank you for inviting me. This was a riveting discussion, and I think the bottom line is to have a lot of faith. Man plans, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best of planners, and as long as you just focus on that, everything will be okay.
Yes,
inshallah.
Yes.
We want to thank you.
Yeah. May Allah bless you, Dr. Vieux. But Aamel, go ahead, please.
Yeah, we just want to thank you, Dr. Ulrick, for joining us. It's truly was an honor to have you. And inshallah, we hope that you will join us again in the future for further discussions. And inshallah, we also want to thank our viewers for their continued participation, their engaging comments, and for staying with us despite the fact that we consistently go well over our allotted time. But thank you so much, Dr. Ulrick. Thank you to all of our viewers. Inshallah, we can end with a short dua, praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us in establishing a just and equitable government for all. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma inna narghabu ilayka fi dawlatin karima tu'izzu biha al-Islam wa ahlah wa tudhillu biha al-nifaq wa ahlah wa taj'aluna fiha min ad-du'ati ila ta'atik wal qadati ila sabilik wa tarzuqna biha karamat ad-dunya wal akhirah. Wa akhir ad-da'wan alhamdulillah rabbil alamin. Wassalamu alaykum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. May Allah bless you. Thank you, Brother Rock.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Aamel. May Allah bless you all. Assalamu alaikum, inshallah.
Islam.